Finishing up chapter 9, we get into error analysis to think a little bit about the students and the types of errors they're making and where they're coming from. We mentioned interlanguage errors, which means they're confusing their first language with their second language, and intralingual errors, which are errors that we even make when we learn our first language, because as we learn the new system. If you think about it, if you learn 3 languages, and you start making mistakes in that third language, how do you know if it's because you're confusing your first language with your third language or your second language with your third language? So, for example, I studied Spanish as a second language, and I was afraid to study Portuguese because I was afraid that the Spanish would mix in with the Portuguese, and then of course I'd still have English to deal with. So I just stuck, with 2 languages at that point. But really, in reality, when you learn a new language, you can learn a third language or fourth language, especially if you just take that language pretty much for what it is. And that leads us to when a student makes an error, kind of what is our reaction? We've talked a lot about kind of focusing on communication. So if a student makes an error, we don't really want to stop them. We want to just keep encouraging them, oh, we understand you, keep talking, and don't stop now. And so as a result, a lot of errors don't get corrected. The student doesn't really get feedback on that. We don't really talk about it, like we don't create a lesson, a little mini lesson on it, maybe at that point. I mean, we could. Students sometimes are frustrated by that. Students will often say, oh, correct me when I make a mistake. I need to know my errors. Don't let me keep talking, especially if it's a conversation partner type of situation. They really want to know what their mistakes are, and is that the right way to say it. And sometimes I keep a notebook so I can kind of write things down and I don't have to interrupt someone when I'm working with someone one-on-one like that. In the classroom, we always have to make those decisions when to kind of interrupt the communication and talk a little bit about maybe a mistake that a lot of the students are making. Generally, when a student makes a mistake, they're following some rule or some system that's their learner language, as we've talked about before. A global error is one that stops the flow of communication. So at that point, we need clarification, or we just have to stop the person. I don't understand you, or what are you trying to say? Whereas a local error is small enough that it doesn't really interfere with communication, so a lot of times we let it go. We have a lot of techniques for giving people feedback, like if someone says, yesterday I play tennis, then we might say, oh, yesterday you played tennis? And hopefully they'll kind of pick it up implicitly that we're trying to model the correct way, and then they might repeat back and say, oh yes, I played tennis yesterday. Or if they say, I played tennis yesterday, you might say, oh, did you mean to use the past tense? And then they'll say, oh yeah, the past tense, played, and they'll kind of correct themselves. Or you could just say, like, what did you say? Suggesting that they made a mistake, or try that again, try saying that again. You made a mistake when you said that, and they'll self-correct, possibly self-correct. If it's just a mistake, they might be able to self-correct like that. But again, always, because we're focusing on communication a lot of times don't focus a lot on errors. In fact, we often say, make mistakes, it's natural, we want you to make mistakes, it's the learning process, don't be afraid to make mistakes. So that puts us in a position where when mistakes come up, we have to have a system for dealing with them. And fossilization is where a student usually has lived in a new country for a while, and they've kind of stopped improving because everyone understands them. they seem to be able to survive, and so they fossilize, and they don't improve that grammar point, and that can go on, for years and years, and sometimes it doesn't really matter because they just have that accent that everyone knows, or people know they're from another country, and we've mentioned before how sometimes we think accents are kind of charming, or it's charming that someone's making these mistakes and we don't really mind it. But basically, most students don't want to be making mistakes. It could limit their job opportunities, could limit getting into a school. It could increase some sort of discrimination, if that's in the culture that they're at. And also, it's interesting to think, depending what language you come from, if we can predict the type of errors that everyone from that language, the type of errors they're probably going to make when they learn English, for example. We know we can kind of predict the pronunciation difficulties that they're going to have based on a contrastive analysis of the two languages. We might be able to predict some grammar mistakes, like subject, verb, object versus subject, verb. If maybe in their language they have subject, object, verb, you might be able to predict that they'll make that mistake. But a lot of times they don't make that mistake. It's rare for me to hear, he paints the wall. It's rare for me to hear a student say, he, the wall, paints, even though actually they would do that in their language. Or some languages, the adjective has to agree with the noun. We say one red shirt, two red shirts, but in some languages it's one red shirt, two reds shirts. But again, you might be able to predict by comparing the languages that they'll make that type of mistake. So that's where we get into instead of contrastive analysis hypothesis, we get into the cross-linguistic influence, CLI, which means that, yes, what your first language is will affect your second language, and we can predict some vocabulary that you might confuse, that everyone seems to do, or obviously the pronunciation. Just the fact that we can recognize accents, we can recognize what country they're from, shows that in a way we can predict the pronunciation errors students from that language will make in English. But applying that to grammar and vocabulary, or even culturally, we can predict if someone comes from a culture that's very group-oriented, we can predict that they might struggle in a very independent type of culture. Or if someone comes from a culture where everyone's late all the time, we can predict they might have trouble adapting to a culture where people are on time or early. And so there is some benefit to a contrastive analysis, but we're just trying to focus on that really when you jump into a new language, it's not all about comparing the two languages. It's not that clean. It's mainly about jumping into this new system and a new culture and taking it for what it is and trying to learn it. And, focusing on errors, we end up in the classroom with a form-focused instruction, FFI, which means that we're questioning, in a way, how helpful it's even going to be to identify the error and give a lesson on it and practice it. That's the form-focused instruction. Do a grammar lesson. Or, sometimes we question how effective that's going to be. Of course, we still do it, and we're still using that, but it's not as much as we talk about that communicative focus that we're looking for. Okay, so that brings us to the end of chapter 9.